that's it.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm with Bob, head of lighting.
I'm Dave's support animal. He's got a bad case of...
So today we're going to talk to you a little bit about our implementation of Solaris, a digital domain, how we implemented it, and one of the shows that we've used it on. It's not meant to be a perfect guide on how anyone else can adopt Solaris. It's just a way of, what were the minimum things that we needed to get up and running in a studio. Any studio that's been around as long as DD has, obviously has a lot of things in their pipeline. So changing technology like this is always a big step, and I'm sure a lot of people are approaching it from different ways. So this is just a little insight into what it took for us to get up and running and deliver a show with it. We've used it so far, and how we got to this point and the technology that we sort of developed to implement it quicker. I'll talk through the minimum workflows that we needed to create to just get up and running and start delivering shots in Solaris. So there are a few things there, a few key things that we identified as the minimum things that we need to be able to just start rendering shots and delivering that we gained from these techniques. What we achieved, a couple of little stats and things came along with switching over to a workflow like this and sort of greater scale of work we're able to do with it. Some of the things we learnt along the way, friends we made, all that kind of fun stuff. And then Bob's going to take over with what we're doing differently going forward, what we learnt from our first show with Solaris and the things we'd like to change and improve on, what we've got in development coming up in regards to our USD pipeline. And we'll circle back and I'll sort of talk about the sort of things that you will need to implement it or may not need in order to get going with a Solaris-based workflow. And we'll wrap it up with a couple of little just explorations and tests that we've done that we're investigating for future additions to our pipeline. So a bit of background. Spider-Man No Way Home was the first film that we used this on. It was a big swing to sort of take on a large film and a large known franchise with a bunch of new technology. So we had a very cool support from our supervisors and our pipeline team who were willing to let us take a swing at changing quite drastically the way we worked in lighting to deliver a lot of work on what is a known property. The sort of stuff that we started with was predominantly exterior sequences, things like in the environment, sets, roads, cars, trees, rivers, all that sort of stuff. That was the majority of the main sequence that we worked on in Spider-Man. It was also used across another sequence, and we ended up around 300 or 400 shots delivered through Solaris on that show. We used it with Redshift at the time that we were investigating Solaris at DD. Redshift was probably the furthest along and suited our needs the most in terms of all the render delegates that were starting to be supported. And we were already a Redshift studio. We used that and V-Ray sort of interchangeably across different shows depending on the needs. And currently, that sort of brings us up to now. Currently, we've got 3 large superhero films on at once, 2 of which we're now using with V-Ray as that delegate has sort of come up to the level that we can use it on our productions, and 1 more continuing in Redshift.
I'm just getting going.
Just getting going, yeah. So why Solaris? So obviously there are a few options out there. You look at things like Katana and Clarice and that, given that DD has prior to its Maya lighting pipeline, has a long history of using Houdini. We decided this is probably something that we wanted to move into. But it was more that there were issues that we currently had that weren't really sustainable in the modern age that we wanted to get around. So one of which is attaching materials. No one likes getting a render back from the farm to find that a material's dropped or something is grey or whatnot. So we wanted to make sure that we had workflows around that meant that wasn't something anyone had to worry about anymore. We had a manual deferred workflow which sort of circumvented the limitations you get within Maya in terms of the number of things you can have in your scene, the number of transforms you can have and all that. And so we built what is the same way that Houdini and Katana handle geometry and the sort of streamed off disk outside of the DCC. We were maintaining our own version of that, which became a lot of work and required a lot of people to make sure that was always up to date. So we wanted to try and move away from that. Scene build time was another one. I can ask Bob, working with the lighting team, that having artists sit there and have to spend a couple of hours waiting for things to load, waiting for things to visualize, just bringing in all the stuff that's in the scene, and the amount of time that takes to cook and establish, you end up with lighters not spending 8 hours a day lighting. You end up with them spending 3 or 4 hours a day of scene building and debugging, and that's not what you want. Everyone wants to make the highest quality work, and the way to make the highest quality work is to give people all the time they need to be artists and not debugging things. We wanted to be able to swap LODs really quickly, and currently we'd have to swap manual versions of different types of products. Like you'd have to swap in an Alembic GPU cache or a full geometry or some kind of point representation. And that was time consuming. We wanted a way to do that quite easily in a scene with very few products. The AutoEasy LOD display bounding boxes item on the list kind of ties into that previous item, where we want to be able to switch between that, sort of in the way that in Katana you have bounding boxes are basically the default way of viewing things until you expand that hierarchy. We wanted something similar, but the ability to change that if needed on a very easy artist-based level, the sort of thing you get in the scene graph tree in Solaris. Not worrying about materials applying correctly, we wanted to make sure we assetized our look dev and our models together so that that wasn't ever a thing. Whenever an asset is in the scene, the material is applied. So you never have to worry about things dropping. There's obviously ways that we can override that later on, but having that happen as part of your lighting scene was something we wanted to avoid. EnviroScatter is a big thing, which everyone does either in the effects department or the Enviro department in SOPs. People want to keep doing that. Getting that into something like Maya is kind of a pain. There's a lot of, depending on the render engine you're using, you might have to bake it into the render engine's proprietary VR scene or Redshift proxy or whatever it is that you're using. And that can get a little bit tricky. So having the ability to do that kind of stuff, all that arbitrary scattering, and keep it within Houdini meant you take out a level of needing to transfer something that just made things kind of frustrating. Lighter and faster scene files, obviously things streaming natively off disk, deferred sort of behavior is something that you want to be able to keep your scenes in a manageable sort of state. So we really, really wanted to adopt something that allowed us to do that. Downstream changes, everyone wants to be able to have the control to make those changes down the line, add overrides, alter the look dev on a certain shot for a certain reason. And you can do that really easily in Houdini, regardless of what context you're in. It can be procedural and it's not going to break something. You don't want to have to kick something back to modeling or whatever because you need a particular extra attribute for a shot. The ability to have that kind of thing happen on the user end is something that we wanted, and DD having a very generalist sort of crew, I guess, people who like to be able to dive in and understand what's going on and make changes on the fly is something that a lot of people really wanted to keep. The main thing we also wanted was to make sure that there was as little disruption to other departments as possible. Given the change as big as this can be quite scary, especially when a studio that's been around as long as DD, we wanted to make sure this is only going to affect the lighting and the look dev departments. So we didn't want to have to change how we publish models or anything like that. So it meant that we didn't start from a full USD pipeline from go to woe, but it meant that we were able to utilize the best parts of Solaris without sort of disrupting the way that other departments work. Obviously, everyone needs to modernize with the changing sort of technology. I mean, we're here at SIGGRAPH, and there's lots of cool stuff that is going to become the norm eventually. And clients have put pressure on you to have things like USD or Material X and sharing products with other vendors. So you need to be up to the status quo with that. So we wanted to make sure we were getting up to speed with those kind of new technologies. And with the number of shots increasing on shows, the amount of time you've got to do these shots, a multi-shot workflow was paramount. That was probably our biggest thing that we really wanted to add to allow people to be able to do more in less time. So the few workflows that we needed to create. If you've been to the wonderful Rise presentation today, you would have seen just the amazing way that they've set stuff up from the beginning through USD in a very Houdini-centric facility with a bunch of people who are very, very talented Houdini artists and have been using it for a very long time. Now, when you're at a studio that's shifting and changing over, it's not as easy to be quite as technical with your setups. You need to make something that everyone can kind of get in and get behind and understand and do it with a minimum disruption. So we identified a few things that were what we needed just to get up and running and lighting shots. So in order for that pesky issue of materials dropping, we had a combined look dev model, which is conceived by Jonathan Gerber, who might be hiding somewhere around the back here. It's pretty simple. You just bring in your Alembic file, you're authoring your material, you publish your material, and then you also publish another product that is referencing that material and that Alembic file. You have the ability to override it later, but it means that when that look dev model is pulled into the scene, whatever you do, apart from overriding its materials, it's always going to have that material. There's no dropping. So it meant that we kind of based everything around having these pre-contained assets. You can scatter them in the environments department, you can lay them out, you can do whatever you want, and they're always there, and it's always going to render the material, and you can just kind of forget about that idea of the material going missing. We already had a highly instanceable C++ SOPs layout importer for our effects department. We wanted to utilize as much of that as we could. Sort of rewriting how we do layouts. We also have a very cool proprietary layout system in Maya, porting that over wasn't going to be possible, but we could leverage what we already had in SOPs. So it meant that we wanted to be able to grab that and put that into LOPS without too much disruption to anyone's workflow. As I said, we don't want layout or modeling or whomever to have to develop a new way of publishing their assets. When you make any new type of workflow like this, obviously you need your things to talk to your asset system. So we needed to create new products that were recognizable by our asset browser. We wanted to be able to publish them out of Houdini. We need to be able to publish them out of Solaris. We needed to be able to load them into Solaris and have these new asset types and product types interact with our asset browser API. So that's probably a little bit of underlying sort of technical pipeline stuff that we had to do to make sure that we could track versioning of assets and things like that. And farm submission, obviously, nothing works if you don't send it to the farm. So a Husk integration with our, not just our farm software, but with our back-end utils for Houdini's interaction with the farm, that needed to be added. But really, it's 4 things. It was 4 main things that we needed to be able to get stuff into a shot, light it, build your shots, send them off to the farm. I know USD can be pretty scary, but with the few things that we had there, we were able to deliver a really big show. So part of this talk is the USD can be kind of scary, but with a little bit of stuff, you can get up and running with it. So the things that it allowed us to do, primarily the multi-shot scene construction of farm submission, made by Mr. Tim Krausen, hiding around here somewhere.
In the middle there.
Wave your hands, Tim. So Tim's written this brilliant system here, which utilizes context variables to drive how we switch between shots. This is a huge win for us because it means that artists can load many shots at once. We're within a little GUI. They can send many shots to the farm. They can choose what passes that they want to do. That kind of became the backbone of us being able to light many shots on Spider-Man and chew through that amount of work and iterate and give a huge amount of power to artists to be productive. So if you can see in that image there, which is a little bit small, basically each shot at the top, random shots are being pulled in and merged. They're getting sequence-based overrides, show-based overrides, certain rules that we apply to anything on that show or in that sequence. And the shot-based overrides happen on the right. And all of these are assetized. So it allowed us to have essentially a scene file-based workflow. People would save their scene files, obviously, but they would assetize, lighting artists would assetize what they were doing on any given day. The beauty of that is that if I have to pick up Bob's shot because Bob's out sick, I can tab down all of the things and build my shot with all the latest stuff, and I can grab all of his assetized scene work, and I've got exactly what Bob had, but with all the updated assets that I might need that may have gotten published since Bob took the day off. So that was really cool. Obviously, a lot of people like working with scene files and being able to track that down, but this is a way of making that a product, making artists publish their things, which meant that it's a lot more trackable and a lot more interchangeable between people despite their different working styles. The singular loading of everything was much easier. Previously, we'd have an asset browser and you'd have to grab all the things that are in your shot bundle or your shot collection and import them. Some of them, you can import them all with one click. Some had to be, imported individually. This kind of meant that everything is just one click. It brings all the right stuff. If everything's marked current, you grab it, it comes in. Again, the easy global sort of overrides and prunes. No certain colored cars on a certain film are allowed. So, okay, right, we can just publish a sequence override where all of those certain colored cars are gone. Those kind of things that you can do and roll out and your artists pick up immediately and can run with, it's way easier than 10 lighting artists going into a scene and all having to prune something out and then resend all their shots, update your sequence variables, send all your shots off to the farm. And the ability to publish working nodes and arbitrary scene graph hierarchies is really cool because it means you can share work or share techniques or share setups that you've got that ordinarily wouldn't be assetized. So we found a way to assetize them, and sharing them around meant that you were able to really standardize things a lot better and make sure that people are working the same way, as well as taking whatever unique things they've made and making them available to everyone else without a hacky copy and paste kind of scenario. So some of the cool stats you can, is that updated? Yes. Here is a similar environment to the one that we had on Spider-Man, and that world was quite enormous, and full credit to our Enviro department who picked up Solaris, and in about 5 minutes had built a large world that we were able to show the client. The big thing about that was the client wanted us to have a full CG world, even though we had plates and everything, because they wanted the freedom to move the camera around, change the shots, the script is going to change, all those kind of things. That full environment gives people the freedom to have those choices in post. And doing that meant that we could, or we had to sort of make everything with a certain level of detail to withstand any sort of scrutiny when cameras were moved in unexpected places or whatnot. So going right down into, you know, close by the water, there's blades of grass, there's rocks, there's, you know, all kind of stuff that was designed to hold up. So, you know, had 700 million polygons in there before instancing, which was about 30 billion rendered polygons in Redshift, with some fun little stats down there on the bottom. We had 3,000 set pieces and props, you know, just so many prims in our scene graph hierarchy, which we'll talk a little bit about later. 1,200 vehicles at any time. Those could be animated, they could be procedurally animated, they're instanced, some of them even had spinning wheels. Just thousands and thousands of trees and plants, just a huge amount of data. Now, obviously, when I said before that, you know, we kind of just wanted everything to come in with very little, you know, implementation of USD stuff, it did mean that you had lots and lots of prims in your scene. So one of the things we're doing moving forward is trying to, you know, reduce the number of prims that are in any given Solaris scene to sort of allow us to have more snappy interaction with recooking. More iterations was a big thing, and that's, you know, multi-shot workflow allows people to sort of iterate and not have to, you know, change render layers and set that render layer and send that to the farm and all that sort of stuff. Having that meant that we could get, you know, the work out in the last few months. Things always change in the last few months of a show, and being able to update and iterate and get them out and still hit targets was a huge thing. And what that did was it established a workflow for easy and fast update and farm submission. You know, no one wants to go through and manually dig around and find the things that they need in their scene. To be able to do it with one click and just send it off to the farm means you go home on time. You know, people can send 40 shots off and, you know, get the renders back the next day. They don't have to open 40 scene files. So the scene complexity was obviously quite large in an environment like this. Things that, you know, sometimes you might break out into different techniques or different ways of, you know, splitting up those renders. It ended up being probably one of the largest environments we've had. It was 2.5 square miles of a portion of New York. And it allowed the building of these large environments, like the instancing power that we got with Solaris and the way that we immediately sort of implemented it and leveraged slot-based scattering, but still the power of, you know, native USD instancing with things through the instance a lot. That kind of became the backbone of how we were able to build at that scale and then throw more and keep more in each render pass. Obviously, you're limited the amount you can do with a GPU renderer in that regard, but it's just nice to know that we could just keep building and building and building. You can break it up and split it out easier later if we needed to, but having that level of scene complexity that we probably hadn't been able to do as easily was a big win for us. And our Enviro artists are loving this and picking it up and running with it on a lot of shows. So the productivity was the big one, and the keys to that were the standardization of things like templates, whether that's show overrides or sequence settings or even just templating someone's work for a particular group of shots. The ability to have that and standardize means that everyone works the same way. Everyone can share their techniques, but it's unified, and it makes it easier for people to go in and debug. Obviously, if you're adopting something like this, there's going to be a finite number of people who are familiar with it, so a lot of the technical support will fall down on a few people. So when you standardize it and when you're able to make those templates, it means that it's easier to support people, and then it allows artists to be more efficient when things are standardized in a certain way that they know what they're getting. The person next to them knows what they're getting. They're both working in an identical fashion. The assetization of shot work, which I mentioned earlier, was a huge one. Being able to share setups and the way that you work between people, not just arbitrary node graphs, which was a huge win, but even things like arbitrary baked down USD files. You may have some really weird scatter system that you've got that you can't really publish, but you can bake it down to USD, stick that in your shot description, and that can come in, regardless of what's in it, into someone's lighting scene file. And really interactive look dev is a huge win. You can see here, this is an old asset from a previous show that has dozens of floors and some heavy textures and concrete and all that sort of stuff. And you just get really snappy kind of interactivity, which, you know, there's something to be said for a dedicated render window. A lot of people like it, but having that sort of fast feedback in your viewport is something that I think people are really looking for more and more these days. And we're still working to improve that workflow and keep it optimized for everyone. But this was, something that the first thing that people use Solaris in the look dev department when they grab this is the thing they're like, oh, cool, this is like, this is nice and snappy. So obviously we learned a few things on the way. You don't sort of dive into a project like that and come out of it and go, yes, we did that perfectly. A couple of things were hard in there, and you learn those the hard way. One of which is that our asset construction, the way those USD files are assembled, is kind of important. You can go back and fix them later in your lighting scene and have overrides and things that will make them better or fix it, but it means that the consequence is more cook times and more iterations of your scene graph tree once you're in that lighting scene file. And putting, lofting your loft hints and making sure you've got your bounding box information, making sure you set things that are going to be instance but are static, as instance bool equals true means that you'll save RAM, and we learn a lot of those things, and we've already rolled them back into the way that we make assets. As I said, the more alterations, overrides, like the things that you need to do to fix any of those assets, more cook time later. Familiarity and training goes a long way. You can make a workflow like this, which is designed as a template for artists who just bring stuff in and light, but people are inherently curious. They're going to dive into things and want to know what's inside it. So you can't really tread the line of obfuscating things from people and having them just make stuff and not worrying about it, but also helping them become more educated about the way that this tool works. To meet that middle ground, you've got to train people, and USD is a big topic, but even just a little bit of how this works, how these assets are constructed, what is happening in this scene, and its hierarchy and why its hierarchy is important. It's a conversation that you have that kind of takes the fear away a little bit, and that's how you walk the line between hiding stuff from people that they shouldn't need to know what a composition arc is necessarily if they're just a lighting artist, versus people who want to know what's going on in there and why. Everything's a prim. Everything's always a prim. So being smart about the way you structure your scene file and what's time dependent and what's not is something that we want to look into further, because it's very easy with the limited USD knowledge that we had when we started this. It's very easy to dirty the graph and force a lot of downstream things to cook, which ends up meaning that your scene files aren't as snappy or as fast or interactive as your lighting artists would want them to be. You can end up with a lot of more cooks than you really want to have happen when a parameter is changed or something is pruned. Native USD instancing, as I said, mark your assets as instanceable, means that you won't have them duplicate in RAM across various point instances or instanceable reference sort of groups. We were finding that stuff was getting doubled up in RAM, and then we're like, oh, okay, it's not sharing that asset across different point instances because we haven't told it to native USD instance. So those kind of like wins, little things that you should know that you only find out after doing it the wrong way, is the kind of stuff that you go back and look at the old scenes and go, oh, okay, right, here are some savings. One of the big things when you're undertaking a new lighting package, everyone's always going to be playing catch up. The render engines and render delegates are going to be, chasing after Karma. They're going to be chasing after whatever is available in Solaris. Everyone has to sort of get that software, usually at the same time that you do, and then implement their stuff. So, if you see something that's great and new, you also have to understand that your software provider has to get up to speed and match that, and that's not always easy. So there's always a little bit of a lag time between what you see and you think, oh, yeah, I would love to have that, versus when that's actually going to work with your proprietary tools, with your cut of Houdini, whichever version that you're using. So there's always a little bit of lag time there for the third-party render delegates. And we learned a lot about GPUs. Surprisingly, with that show, we only had, I think it was 300 GPUs at our farm. Not enough. And a lot of them were mostly artist workstations. So we managed to deliver hundreds of shots with a GPU renderer on this with Solaris on Spider-Man. And it was frighteningly few resources that we were able to utilize and deliver a lot of work. The limitations of that are obviously going out of core with the finite amount of VRAM and all that sort of stuff. GPU crashes on a farm are a little trickier to debug. There's not as much history there of them being used so consistently, so you get a little bit more cryptic kind of errors. So that was a learning experience, but we powered through and got it done. I'm going to hand it over to Bob to tell you what we're going to do going forward.
Oh, now I get to dig into some of the nitty-gritties of how some things work. I want to say that anything that I'm going to say here about pain points that we hit, it's astounding how much work we were able to get through with these. We got through more work in a less amount of time with fewer artists, with minimal pain as we were doing this stuff. And so as I talk about pain points, I'm like, that was a real pain point. It's like a tenth of what like a standard Maya pain point was. Like that graphic that was up there a little while ago of the platforms, I can see the lighting artist that was here, and she was spending like 3 to 4 hours just waiting for scenes to load to run that in Maya, and it like you could pan in and out on it. It was crazy. So what we're doing differently going forward, well, one thing we're trying to enhance is our lighting workflow with an eye specifically towards the lighter experience. Solaris is a fantastic scene management tool, but it is still a little rough around the edges on some of the lighting tool side things. Viewport rendering, like Dave was saying, it's super convenient, it's super flashy, it's like really cool to be able to like pan around things that you're working on, but there are still things that are nice in a viewport render, or like a dedicated renderer with all the accoutrement that comes along with that. And a lot of our lighters are really kind of missing that still. The Light Mixer Lop is a really great start, and it's really going to be a way that we go forward. And I know that Tim Croson is actually looking forward to working closely with SideFX to push that into a tool that we can actually use and make into something really where lighters can live. A lot of our lighters prefer light-centric lighting, where you look through a light to move it around and quickly position it. And early iterations of our setup, when a lighter would move a light that way, it would create new edit light nodes underneath whatever lop you had currently viewed, which just meant that the lighter would have to track down those nodes and cut them out, move them back into our lighting area so that they could be actually published, which is fine if you're a Houdini veteran. We've actually implemented insertion points, which tells the lop graph exactly where those nodes need to go, and lighters are enjoying it. We've actually been working with the SideFX team a lot to see where we can make gains. Luca is here somewhere. I saw him earlier. He's actually come into our studio and dug into our setup with us a few times, and we're actually finding he's helping us find potential savings across the board. Things like parallelizing our graphs as much as we possibly can and attempting to minimize prim counts like Dave was talking about. Just like cutting down the prims in our assets so that we don't have to iterate over quite as much as often. We also found that we had a bunch of unnecessary time-dependent nodes where things that just didn't need to be time-dependent were because we didn't know better. And we're finding places that we can actually shuffle things that do need to be time-dependent into places that don't get cooked quite as often. Another thing we're doing is investigating caching out chunks of our scene graph. So if we have a dense, heavy piece that cooks a lot, we're looking into being able to cache that portion of the graph into a local USD file and have it live in the user's scene. And then when they submit to the farm, it would pick up the live nodes again. And I mean, obviously the drawback is that you're potentially working with out-of-date assets in your scene, but the speed of that is worth the trade-off. And the speed, like that is also something that we can train for. Like Dave was just saying a few minutes ago, dedicated training in Houdini is critical. It's always, it's absolutely a major focus point for us going forward. Houdini hasn't really been used a whole lot in a lighting context at DD, and like the idiosyncrasies of Houdini are really new for a lot of our people. A ton of our issues that come up are actually due to people just not knowing, or they don't know what a certain node is, or they don't know what it should be doing, or what they need to bring in. So like that's always a problem, and integrating any new lighting package like this into a studio with deep lighting trenches like DD is really hard. It has to shake people up and make them reevaluate their methods of thinking. And that is a really hard thing to do when you have limited documentation for them to fall back on, because Tim and Dave are writing it in their spare time, and when you only have a few key people like Tim and Dave, who are the two that you can fall back on to get information from. So broadly expanding our tech docs and our training initiatives. We're working with SideFX on with their training team to help come in and with that stuff. That's all a huge, huge focus for us going forward. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we got in the hopper. We are doing some farm-based scene extractions. The way that we currently submit our renders to the farm is like with Tim's cool ShotLink setup. When you're going to submit your shot to the farm, it bakes the entire scene and kick a farm-based Python session for each shot in there and run out that shot's individual file, which then gets submitted. Long-term, obviously, we want to abstract that into an API for our toolset so that it's faster and has more functionality. We're also looking into USD stitch clips. Our animation comes in as Alembic point caches generally, and then those get layered onto the geo. But when you have a massive cache, when you have a really big scene cache, changing frames sucks. It gets real slow because it's got to reload the whole cache, and then it's got to recook the scene. And the USD-based cache, though, the initial cook might be a little bit longer or a similar time, but it generally cuts the severity of any future cooks as you change frames drastically. So the stitch clips, the USD stitch clips ROP is actually proving to be pretty cool, and we're going to use it to stitch large anim caches. Material X, like Dave was saying, we're getting a ton of pressure from other vendors to, like other studios to do asset sharing. We obviously share models and textures and have forever. But now they want look devs, and they're coming for our rigs next. But we're leaning on everyone that we work with to be able to support Material X as quickly as we can. Sorry, I don't usually talk this long or very often in front of people. So LOPS-style assetizations of effects caches. I wrote that, and I really feel like that was a mouthful of a sentence that I should have not actually written down.
I think I wrote that one for you.
Oh, probably. That makes more sense that you wrote it, and I. Unfortunately, just publishing BGOs doesn't really work, as it's not a super effective way to bring effects assets into scenes. We actually have an effects look dev resolver that packs up all the pieces of the effects scene, brings them into the scene, assigns the look dev, sets all the vars, does all that stuff. It's amazing. It works really well when everything is set precisely. But we all know that effects artists like to play fast and loose with asset naming and attributes and things like that. So rather than try to just constantly enforce strict rules and fail at enforcing strict rules, we're trying to find ways to minimize and push back on those without too much interruption. Character work with grooms. Our dev team has been hard at work trying to bring our proprietary hair system, Samson, into Solaris, and it's made some really great strides kind of recently. In its current state, though, it converts our procedural hair geometry into full hair geo, just because it doesn't interact with any procedural stuff yet. So it's not super ideal, but it's really manageable. And by using render purposes, we are able to keep the scenes pretty snappy. So it means that we bring in guides for visualization, and we only ever see the actual hair at render, which it works, but that new Solaris hair procedural is going to bring us into a new space, and we started doing some tests with Karma's stuff in it, and now we just need one from Chaos. If anyone from Chaos is here that can push that and get us going. Dave actually was able to bring some of our guides in and cobble together a render that worked. It's got some limitations. It's a little bit janky here and there, but it worked pretty great, and he's Dave. Continued render engine developments. We've been using V-Ray and Maya forever, and the last few years we've been using Redshift a lot. Both of them being in Solaris, it was only natural that we'd end up using them there as well. And while they both have their strengths, Redshift is crazy fast, V-Ray is super stable in Solaris. It's crazy. But they both have drawbacks as well. Redshift is limited, again, like we were saying, by our lack of GPU farm. And V-Ray is still in its early days in Solaris, so there's still some kinks to work out. We're constantly working with those guys, both sets, to smooth out and update as much stuff as we can. But also, like Dave was saying earlier, we're about to wrap up one massive blockbuster film using V-Ray for Solaris for enviros, effects, some character work, I think, right, Tim? And we're about to use it as our sole package on another like crazy mega superhero movie. So we're going to be relying on Chaos and Side Effects both for a lot of help, as much as you can as we go, support and help. USD assets and USD layouts, like we were talking about earlier, that's obviously one of those things that we could have done to get this stuff working. We're now starting to dig into it. I really want to preface this with a hard warning that me and Dave are not the big brains who've been hard at work deving this out. That's Jacob. He's the big brain that's been deving this out. And he's going to get really mad at me in a second because I'm going to put up a graphic and he's going to be like, you bastardized my graphics, because he has these beautiful like plans of how all this stuff goes together and all the testing that he's done to put into it. And I have dumbed it down to its absolute bare bones. These are not final. They're not. Nothing that we're about to show you is, just want to give you a peek behind the curtains, man. So our LookDev model asset structure worked pretty well as a prototype. It was pretty clear, though, that USD assets and USD layouts were where we stood to see the most significant gains going forward. By solving all of those issues in the upcoming data streams, we actually stand to solve a bunch of other issues like variance, levels of detail, optimizations of monster layouts, that sort of stuff, kind of for free, right? By giving ourselves the maximum amount of potential granularity in our layouts and assets, we still allow every show to work to its needs without limiting some and absolutely drowning others. In this slide, there are these are all essentially just layers in USD files. Basically, it's an asset set that's just a USD assembly. It can be as macro or microscopic as we need. And into that, we're referencing a parent asset. The model variant, that selects a model variant. There's at the end there, those LOD variants, those actually payload in the geometry. So at that point, sorry, Jacob, this is massacring your stuff. Yeah, so we're payloading in the geometry in that stage. Similar to the model variants, the material variant set has one step in it that we're calling material mapping. It's a layer that defines the material assignments and adds structure for the materials in the scene graph. And by referencing the material definition into the material mapping, then we actually can make use of procedural and library shaders while maintaining the stability of our LookDev model prototype. Instead of picking an LOD, the renderer variant picks up the appropriate render delegates, materials and textures and all of the things that go with it. And every other step in there basically just adds structure. The first model that gets, model, material, anything that gets published into an asset will automatically be our default variant. And anything after that will get, as part of our publish, we're checking to see if that should be an update to the default variant or a new variant in there. It's a lot of words, so here's a more practical example. In this case, we have a spaceship asset set, bringing in a slightly broken up asset with 3 main sections. This is where we kind of really gain maximum flexibility. You could have just one asset there called ship instead of breaking it up into 3 like this, or you could have each individual component of that ship broken out into its own model and work from there. It's really up to you, but that could get super overwhelming. You could if you wanted to, but only if you needed to. In our ship, the hull, a full fleet of ships. You can actually see on the left how this would sort of shake out in the stage. It really just leaves a ton of room for this to have flexibility and be an easy workflow going forward. Let's talk a little bit about layouts. Our existing layout setup involves bringing in all the assets for a layout and then live instancing those across the scene. Obviously, we needed a way to start having those assets be instanced as they come into the scenes. Again, the focus is on maximum granularity control to stay flexible enough to meet our needs, but also manageable in scene. In this case, the layout bundle is a USD assembly, and we sublayer in a layout. That layer can reference USD chunks or other layouts. Layout chunks are actually what's payloading in the instanced assets. And the thing that makes these layouts interesting is that any layout can receive tons of overrides and potentially masking as well. Like you can mask out, I think actually, Jacob, it's just the top one that can mask populations, right?
Multiple levels.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So it gives us a ton of flexibility and allows us places that you can drop in overrides and block things in and out. A super basic example of how it could look. This is kind of the most simple version of it. It's a layout bundle, sublayering in a layout that's referencing a single chunk that is instancing several assets. In reality, it will probably look something more like this, where it is continuously expansible. Next one. Maximum granularity would let you assetize the nuts and bolts and other parts of a stacking chair, instance those all into a stacking chair layout, and then move them around and into a layout chunk, move them all around and assemble the chair like a piece of IKEA furniture, and then move that chair chunk into a row layout, and then, reference that chair chunk into a row layout, and then that could get referenced into an audience layout, and so on and so on. The end result just gives you so much flexibility. You can make it as optimized for instancing as possible at the price of seeing complexity, or as basic as you want. And really that's the target for a studio with as diverse a show lineup as us. We have everything from commercials to video games to episodic work and feature film stuff that has to get really in depth. So, yeah.
All right, well, that's where we're going. Part of this talk is about sort of allaying a lot of fears that a lot of people have. A lot of people come to you and sort of go, how did you do it? Like, they're waiting for other people to try a show with Solaris or switch their pipeline and seeing what shakes out and how they can then take all that and go on and move forward. And I think a lot of people are a little bit hesitant to dive into it because USD can be quite overwhelming. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of things that I think you need to adopt it. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have, the way that Rise did it, which is perfect from start to end. It's not going to always be possible to do that in your studio. It depends on what kind of historical pipeline architecture you have. It depends on your budget. It depends on how many people you've got. It depends on the experience of your pipeline crew. But there really is very little that you need to get going. And there's never going to be a perfect time to start it. The number of people that I've had come and talk to me and say, how can we get going with it? You've just got to dive in and fail. We did a lot wrong. We did a lot right, but we only got there by jumping in and doing it and trying, and you're going to learn more by going and doing that. You'll never get your head around USD, and you'll never get it right perfectly. No one will ever construct the perfect stage with all the assets that are in their certain show the first time. You got to fail and just fail fast. That's how you're going to get your head around adopting something like Solaris if you're coming from a studio that is used to using a different kind of DCC. A basic understanding of USD is enough. You will benefit from more advanced knowledge of composition arcs, but it's not necessarily get up and get going. You can generate a decent working tool set, which we did on Spider-Man, with very little knowledge and very few resources. The more you know about it, the more understanding you have of those hierarchies and seeing composition, the more benefit you'll get. But it's not necessary to get up and going. You will get a lot of speed gains out of that kind of thing, but that's a part of a learning process and working out how optimizations in general tie in with the type of work that you're doing, the type of assets that you have. It's also possible with a very small pipeline crew. We had very few people, a couple of soups, Tim and myself, and a few pipeline people who are always juggling multiple shows and multiple projects. And we supported a 600-shot show, 300 or 400 of them in Solaris, with just that. So, it's not impossible, and you don't need an enormous wealth of resources to dive in and start doing it.
Yeah, that's just to jump in and then continuously refine from there going forward.
Yeah. So now I've got a couple of nerdy little tests that I've just been playing around with because I know that effects people in general are a little bit hesitant to leave Mantra and all the amazing things that Mantra can do. But I'd been doing some explosion tests just to sort of see, well, what's the visual quality comparison between rendering with Mantra and rendering with Karma. So this test here is a little bit insane. I've got a bunch of bounces in there. I've got 2 distant lights, 1 environment light, 16 by 16 samples, volume bounce, diffuse bounce, which you generally don't want to do with your Pyro if you want it to ever finish rendering. And so this frame was about 1 hour and 26 minutes. And then I just SOP imported it into Karma, and with the variance indirect rendering profile, it went down 30 minutes. Exact same settings, exact same number of bounces, same lights, same everything. So that's pretty decent 30-minute knockoff. It's the same shader, just imported straight in. And this was in Houdini 19. So then I switched over to the distributed model, and it went down 15 minutes with all the same amount there. So I think a lot of effects people were a bit afraid at first of the speed differences between Mantra and Karma, but I think it's safe to say that it's definitely caught up, and is something we'll be looking into in terms of setting up tools in lighting for effects artists to render through. Much easier to share lighting rigs and things like that. Another little test here is just some volume things, 8 area lights in there with various different render times. Obviously huge advancements between Karma and Houdini 18 and Karma and Houdini 19, almost half the render time for the same image. And a surprising test with V-Ray there, which not a lot of people I think use with volume, certainly not with Pyro, probably more with Smoke. And that was 3 minutes, and it actually had 3 times the number of indirect bounces. So that was a really cool test for a studio that has been using V-Ray for a long time. So I think that's one of the scary things for a lot of people, is moving away from known render engines, especially Mantra, which is so feature complete, and worrying that the features in Karma or whatnot were not quite there. But the kind of speed gains you get out of it and the same visual quality is pretty hard to deny. We touched a little bit on before about Samson, our proprietary grooming system. I had to play with it the other day and brought this in and played with some Karma XPU. And this is between 30 and 50 seconds a frame. This is the full groom that's generated every frame. We're looking to plug this into the new hair procedural in LOPS. But this was just blazingly fast, just rendered it locally. Kind of fun to see. And it sort of leads into our finishing point of this sort of stuff. This in particular was developed by Darren Williams at DD. We have a lot of talented people like Jacob Kanyuk there, Claude Martens, Tim Krausen, Steve Huan. Some people who are no longer at DD, Jonathan Gerber and Stephen Sloan, who really made all this happen. There's no way we could have undertaken a giant show that kind of client on that sort of known superhero property, and 2 very large superhero films coming up without the support of those very talented people, allowing Bob and Tim and I to invent crap and then they pipeline it for us. So it's
You do it messy, they fix it.
yeah. But thank you to all those people, and thank you to everyone here for coming along and hearing us talk nerdy for a little bit. And hopefully, you guys take away something from this that helps people sort of plant their foot a little bit further into the Solaris pool. If you want to come work with us and join us on this adventure, please check out our website, our careers website, careers.digitaldomain.com, hiring across all roles, but with special preference, obviously, for USD and Solaris people. And yeah.
Lighters and look deaf, please.
Lighters and look deaf, please.
Please join us. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you didn't quite do it, Dave. You told me you were going to talk for long enough that I wouldn't have to answer any questions, but I think there's room. Some time.
And Tim's going to answer the questions for us.
There's 7 minutes. So, yeah, questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Does anyone have any questions? Oh. No, we want to capture this.
Thanks.
So yeah, I just wanted to ask, you're still using Alembics, right? Why not switching to USD geometry instead?
We intend to.
Yeah, it's a big part of our Anim pipe right now. Is still we just haven't rolled that stuff over yet. We most likely will roll our entire Anim pipe once we get more USD support across the studio. But a lot of USD integration has been kind of only on the like more updated layout tools that we're working on and that stuff moving forward. But yeah, it's coming.
It also ties into the, disturb the other departments as little as possible. If you go to the whole facility, hey, you're going to change how you export, and you change how, it's that saying, how do you boil a frog? Slowly, right? So we start changing lighting, we're changing look dev, and then now we'll have new products coming out of animation and new products coming out of layout. It's high on our list of priorities, but wasn't necessary at the time in order to just get people lighting.
We have exactly the same story. Like we are on the Olympics.
Hey, Johnny.
Oh, can you, sorry, just, we want to record this.
We're doing exactly the same. We're packaging Olympics in the USD, send it to Houdini, do the rest stuff, bring back to Maya, render in Maya. But we're switching to Solaris right now. So my question is, do you guys still do animation in Maya, right?
We do. Yeah.
So if and environment's still in Maya or in Houdini?
Sorry?
Environments. Where do you do?
Bit of both.
If the show is a Solaris show, then they are desperate to get into. Like, I was at a lunch yesterday, and our head of Enviro messaged me, and she was like, "Please, can we have a Solaris Revolution as soon as you're back from SIGGRAPH?"
In this case, my question. So you guys build environments in Solaris Houdini, but you need to bring it back to animation. Like how? Like so, animators actually walk around. Do you guys localize, extract it, and bring it as Olympics, or how do you? Oh, you just bring it as a USD.
There's two different ways that we do it. Generally, a base level of layout is done in Maya first, and then the environment stuff is generally adding on top of that. If it is a purely designed environment that's started in the Enviro department, we have a couple of tools that can bake it back out and then reconstruct it in Maya. But it's an in-house sort of layout publishing tool, which is really, it's kind of the reverse of how we're getting layouts in. These instance points, you basically end up baking points. It's keeping those attributes on them. And in Maya, they bring in an XML file that is pulling in all that point data, and they reconstruct it.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to go through the pain, I see.
Yeah, we'd like to go back the other way because there are some issues with going from Solaris back into Maya with path attributes and accurately getting that hierarchy to reconstruct, which is a little bit tied into some of the proprietary stuff that we're doing. But ideally, yes, moving forward, it's going to be a more standardized format regardless of which direction you're going.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is just to let people know I'm a recruiter at Digital Domain. The guys forgot about me, but it's okay. So if you guys have any interest or anything, I'll be here for a little bit for another 15 minutes after the session if you want to connect. But anyways, that's just a shout out.
Way to toe the company line.
I was curious, when you were deciding on lighting packages, did you evaluate other packages? Or did you?
Yeah, we tried all the delegates that were available at the time. It was still Houdini 18 or 18.5 that we were in.
I think it means lighting packages, not renderers.
You're talking Katana then.
Katana or Gaffer?
Yeah,
yeah.
We did. There's a bit of a
history
with Katana.
Using Katana at DD in the past before we were there. And yeah, so we did definitely, but like kind of Dave was alluding to, one of the real things that happens at DD is our lighting team are really senior, and they actually kind of like digging in and like solving problems and finding ways around things. And there is a real push to not have our lighting team just kick problems back up the stream. Lighting is always the last line of defense against, we're just the staunch defenders of comp, like we're the last ones. And if you have to make a geometry change or anything like that, you don't want to have to kick it back up to modeling and when it's 4 p.m. on a Friday and you want to just be able to kick that render. So for us, Solaris kind of made sense, right? You get Solaris, which is so close to Katana in some ways, and then you also have Houdini in there, so you can just jump in and make those geo changes yourself without any effort. So
There is obviously, like, even in the pre-Maya days, DD was a Houdini studio. It was lit. Pre that, it was Prisms. We'd be lying if we said there weren't political things involved. Like, there's, your relationships with your software vendors, the price of things like Katana comes into play, the integration of the render engines that certain shows want to use is a factor. So all of that was taken into account. This kind of was where the stars aligned in terms of, okay, what's the path of least resistance for people who are going to pick something up and be with it, and the number of people that had a bad experience with another piece of software 15 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever. It kind of pointed to, like, this is a tool that more people are going to get behind. Looking at our talent base, this Houdini was where more people were savvy, especially with the senior crowd.
It also helped that our CFX team has recently rolled almost essentially to, like, entirely to Houdini. So more Houdini in studio just means more knowledge base, and everybody gets there faster.
Cool, thanks.
Speaking about rooms, so like if you guys
Hang on,
They need the microphone to record.
I guess you might have touched a little bit in the previous answer. Like, I was going to ask, did you guys find any departments that they were a little bit opposed? Maybe obviously not FX, but other departments that were a little bit opposed to switching to a full Solaris pipeline?
There were early kind of concerns because DD primarily used Houdini for effects work. There were concerns that we didn't necessarily have enough TDs that knew Houdini outside of the effects team, and so that we were kind of going to be stealing the effects TDs and that there wouldn't be enough to go around. But I feel like those kind of got smoothed over as we went, just because you're expanding that user base and you're expanding the knowledge base to more people. And so it as soon as you could make them see that really they were not losing their effects TDs, they were gaining a whole, like, studio of Houdini savvy TDs, right? So now you got a question about how am I going to get this light stuff to work? Well, you ask the lighting TDs.
Hey, I have a rendering question. So in a lot of your examples, you have like support for like a V-Ray version and a Redshift version.
Yeah.
So why the need for the support to renders, and then how do you decide what goes into Redshift versus V-Ray?
That was more like that structure was more. We're not necessarily going to always put both materials into that product, so that you can, I'm going to render this one in V-Ray, I'm going to render that shot in Redshift. That's more of a deciding on which show to go. I mean, there are different shows have different requirements. Different supervisors have a certain preference. It's always hard to say, okay, we're going with this render engine if half the studio is really invested in the other one. So that's more of taking all things into account when you're looking at the building of that asset. It's like, okay, right, it's effects might want to render it, so maybe we'll just do a quick look dev in Karma as well, so that if they want to bounce some light off and that sort of thing. So that is more like covering yourself for whichever render engine you go for. But I mean, part of this is we want to move away, and by we I mean me and Bob, move away from mixing render engines and stuff across a show. It creates a lot of work, and that's also why we brought about Solaris, is because we want to stop rendering stuff in different packages. Eventually, we'll be able to render all our effects stuff in here as well. We won't have some stuff in Houdini and Mantra and some stuff in Maya and whatever. It'll all be in Solaris, and we can all use the same light rig, and we don't have to do no darn light transfers from one package to another. Just so fun.
So fun.
Yeah. So does that answer your question?
Speaking about lighting rig, how do you guys do it? Like, let's say there is a sequence. Do you do the master sequence light rig, then the environment light rig, then the overrides per shot, or you just do it in a shot? Because again, Rise, I spoke to them, they do like per shot almost lighting rigs. So how do you guys approach it?
Yeah, you kind of hit it right on the nose. We do environment light rigs and sequence light rigs, and then modifications on those in shot, and that's a published asset overrides, right? So instead of having to actually publish out light rigs per shot, I mean, obviously if there's additional lights or anything like that you're adding in that shot, we do publish out the
that tends to go into I don't know if we publish them as light rigs, but it often goes into the per shot overrides. Like there's an area in our graph where the lighting artists will work, and if they have certain shot specific requirements with certain lights or a new rig or whatever, that'll go into their shot product, like their overrides. But we obviously, you know, if there's the direction changes as a whole from based on client feedback on a sequence, then the CG Soup or the lighting lead will roll that back into the sequence setup so that everyone can get it. But it's not often that you really need, or we've found that we really need to publish a per shot light rig. It's more that an artist designing that shot assetizes their work, and that light rig is inherently in part of that shot asset.
And if you publish light rigs, do you publish as the USD, as the HD, or just keep it in the HIP files? And like, how do you guys propagate this stuff?
As a USD file. I'm looking at Tim to nod.
But
different ways.
But USD doesn't keep the whole Houdini structure. So let's say if you bring some, I don't know, like Python node, it's gone. Exactly.
And that's something we're working through at the moment, is that has implications with things like the light mixer. I have been reading your chats, Tim. It's been a busy week. Yeah, it has implications because obviously you can't unfold that whole structure and have everything that's there if it is assetized as a USD file. It's kind of like, you know, the edit material lop, you go, oh yes, that's great with Karma, I can unfold this and I get all my original material nodes. It doesn't necessarily work with every rendered delegate. If you've got custom nodes in there or certain extra texts or files, you know, sometimes that can break. So it's a work in progress. We have been baking some of them out as USD, but yeah, you can tend to find that overrides later on are a little bit limited. So we kind of do it in a couple of different ways.
Because we're literally trying to save both. So let's say we use USD as just propagation and publishing, but if you need to open the whole flow, then you substitute it to the HD.
Yeah, we also have a node graph published, which is basically stick your arbitrary, kind of like an HDA, but more asset based on living in our asset browser. So I can say I want these nodes to become an asset. And they're just a bunch of nodes, and they go into your asset browser, and anyone can open up asset browser and pull it in. So that's kind of which is sort of like a CPIO file, I guess, a little bit that you've made into a product. That's our way of getting around it for now. There's a few little kinks to work out, and there's kind of 10 different ways to do it. But at the start of a show, if you're like look deving something, it's like, here's the light rig is baked out as a USD, because they're just environment lights that need to rotate.
Quick question. At Digital Domain, the layout department, is that the bridge between the effects department and USD and the animators transferring all that stuff over? How does that work with you guys?
Yeah, our layout department tends to do a lot of technical layout. So when we have kind of a master layout setup, whether that's by layout or Enviro, they'll jump in and make sure the cameras and all that stuff are in there. Is that kind of what you mean,
like
Phil?
With the rigs for, like, say, the rigs between that are going back and forth between the anim department. So animation's working on the rigs. I'm guessing that's not able to transfer within USD, but is the layout department still like maintaining your the USD information for you guys, or is that handled within like effects and things like that?
A lot of that is still early dev for us.
Okay.
Like I was saying earlier, our layout department, or our layouts still come in as scattered geo, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, it's abstracted from having the kind of product that you're talking about. The layout data is written out as an XML file, which is just points, and then whatever DCC is bringing it in reconstructs it based on that point data. So you're not really going to have rigs going back and forth or interactions, but layout can publish animated layouts, and anim can publish layouts that can go back to anim or go to lighting or whatnot. We have these little sort of side products that come with along for the ride, that allows either department to push the product in either direction. It's not USDified at all at the moment. That will be what we're moving to eventually, but a little bit different to I think what you're used to, Phil, like from Method, that kind of style.
Cool. They're coming with Jacob's setups.
Was one. Can I pass it down?
Hello. If FX has to use the light rigs and render layers from lighting, how does that interaction go between FX and lighting? Do they use the assetized like files for each of the shots, or how does that work?
When effects want to light their own stuff in Solaris, we haven't really got the effects department doing that yet. But I mean, what we intend to do moving forward is give them essentially a cut down version of what the lighters are using. You get the light rigs, your product is published and comes in the shot description, and yeah, I mean, like we asset those node graphs that I showed earlier. Here's your stuff coming in for that shot. Here is your show rules and overrides. Here's your sequence overrides. And your light rigs usually in the sequence one, and then here's where your stuff will be, where you can make additions. But the hope is that we don't really want to do SOP imports because we kind of need to assetize things a little bit better than that, because whatever anyone does in a SOP import, we kind of want to standardize the way that if an effects artist is going to light things with the lighter's light rig, we want them to light it the same way. So they're going to make their product, they will open up, put down the template, their product will be in there, and they'll light it and render it. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, just a question. Do you guys try to keep your layers in general, or do you just flatten everything before getting everything out?
Everything's a little bit default. We want to get better into layer construction. It just has so many savings in terms of muting things, having load masks, updating and overriding. At the moment, it's a little bit of a payload all the things unless there are specific cases. And that's part of the whole, we didn't need to get started, We do want to now moving forward because of the optimizations that it brings, but layering is something that, Tim is looking into, and we're starting to get incremental benefits in terms of, speed savings in scene construction.
We were just talking to Jacob, and he was running us through a setup that basically, we're moving towards complete layers for everything.
And I think that's the fun thing about this is it's like, hey, we built some stuff and we did some shows and it's fun to use. And now when you're learning more about it, it's like, oh, this is going to be way better.
Yeah.
That's the fun thing about sort of diving in and making something that maybe wasn't perfect but was still reasonably efficient. And then,
oh my God, that's so much better.
And then
Why didn't we do that the first time? Yeah.
I wish we did that the first time. That would have solved problem A, B, and C, and D. But it's an evolving experience.
Related to that, you talked earlier about looking at exploring caching out your scene graphs to USD files. And in what ways do the USD payloads kind of not solve the problem that you're trying to solve that way?
It's actually more like chunks that aren't necessarily being payloaded currently. Right now, we have things like live instanced geometry that are brought into scene, and by payloading those out, by baking those into a file, that's where we're at.
So at the moment, it's kind of like you have an instance of LOP and you have all the look dev models brought in and they're just plugged in and scattered around based on that XML layout data or scatter that's come internally from Enviro, which means that will always recook. When a prim changes, that stuff will always recook. So sidecarring that and putting it out as a proper product, even if it's only temporary, is just going to allay the number of iterative cooks that happen on things that don't need to. We learned a lot of lessons on that show that we thought we were sort of really making something a product, but really it was, no, this is going to build on the fly every cook. So now we want to go and pull a lot of that out and make sure that things are assetized in a much better way so that you really have faster performance in the lighting scene, and you're ending up with products that go into your scene, not tools that are building things in your scene.
To continue with that question, are you caching things at the shot level or at the sequence level?
You mean on a given shot, you go, okay, we're caching out everything that's in this shot or everything that's in this sequence?
Yeah, basically, you're saying you're baking things out to speed things up for the artists. Are you able to bake things out at the sequence level so that you can utilize that cache across multiple shots, or are you doing?
Yes.
Or you have to do it per shot?
We have, and we did that on Spider-Man, especially for things like arbitrary scatters. It's like, well, okay, we don't want that to recook, or we don't want that to recalculate, and we'd bake that out to an arbitrary USD file. And we had two ways. We could do it as a USD file that will come back into your scene and you get the scene graph hierarchy, or sometimes there's a node graph where you get the whole thing so you can make changes as needed. But obviously doing it as the USD file is the one where you get the savings. You don't have to cook that anymore. So we started doing that at the end of that show, but it's not a formalized process. It was kind of just an HDA that they could plug all their stuff into and publish it, and it would go into our asset browser. We want to have it more like this is the product the environment team passes downstream to lighting, not just oh, hey, grab this also, and then someone puts it in the sequence setup. You know, we want to bring that back into the whole top node we have, which is building all the things that are in our shots. So that's kind of what we're talking about, and sort of offlining some of that.
Is the artist aware that there's something that they need to load? Does it do it automatically? And can they decide, hey, actually, I need to do something custom and recook it myself?
All of the above?
All of the above, no. Yeah. They kind of, the Enviro artist that's making that just knows that they're making and publishing a layout. And if that gets put into the sequence description of what goes into shots, you know, the shot description, then no one knows anything about it, or no one knows what it has to. A lighting artist can still see that hierarchy in there and still see it in their viewport and select it and prune it or do whatever they want to do with it. You know, it's still a product that they can act on, but you know, if someone published a node graph of those things, the lighting artist wouldn't necessarily know that, oh, that's a live thing that's going on in there. And we kind of want them to keep it that way, but we want to make sure they're getting the product. We don't want to hide from them that there's a live product in there. We want to give them a published product that they don't have to think about.
Thank you.
So about this, I guess, does it mean you're not planning on using the USD asset resolver so you get updates all the time?
We would love to. That's on the longer roadmap.
Those are all longer roadmap things, yeah. We would love to use, I think we're actually talking about our own asset resolvers, but the USD asset resolver is on the map as well.
It's you know, it's a long code base of proprietary stuff of how we bring things in and how products that are live in your scene are maintaining references to our network and URIs and things like that. So that is a big project, but you know, there are some niceties that we want to flesh out and the things that we said we're moving forward with that we want to kind of get for user experience before we get into the hardcore optimization of resolving assets. But yeah, I'd love to have an asset resolver, but a little bit down the line.
It's coming. It's coming.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much, Dave and Bob, and thanks everyone for attending.